In this video, I'm going to be talking about my approach to environment design, about how I use 3D to make 2D illustrations, and how I use sketching and reference material to arrive at a final product, such as the one you see on screen now. I'll be showing the entire process of this particular piece from sketch till finish, and I hope to talk about some of the methods and tricks that I've used in this particular painting. The first thing I do, even before starting to sketch, is usually writing down some keywords, some ideas, or some concepts that I know that I want to be integrated in my painting. And along with the sketches that I'll make eventually, these keywords I'll use as a kind of reference material throughout the whole process to be able to check back on and see if the image that I'm making is still fulfilling its original intentions. So one of the words that I wrote down for this painting was reflection. So I'm trying to make sure with these sketches that reflection is definitely a part of, or some part of my design. And I'm pretty quickly like settling for a completely natural way of reflection. So no polished metal or actual mirrors, but I'm going with either water, like a completely flat water surface, or crystals, and kind of working that into my environment. You see me drawing a little scheme here, which is pretty much just me trying to figure out if a particular environment that I made would kind of work, I guess, would make sense or be somewhat logical. So I'm not making something that is not believable or not convincing. The next step I usually take is looking for references. I try to do this when my ideas are still pretty rough, so they can change and they are still a bit malleable. And I can just look at pictures online and be inspired or get new ideas from any of these pictures. So I looked at some materials that I wanted to use, like the crystals or the ice, and also add some basalt rocks. Like the basalt rocks have these pillars, which I find super interesting. So I want to kind of incorporate that into my environment, and that's what my reference in this stage is about. At this stage, I will also do some research if I find it necessary. You saw me sketching a little diagram in the previous step about how, like, how geographically, even though this is an alien planet, how geographically this kind of picture would come into existence. Now that I have a better idea about what sort of landscape I want to create and what kind of materials I want to put in this landscape, as it were, I'll start working on a bit more of an elaborate sketch to design the environment, if you will. This is nothing to do about composition or storytelling or any of that yet. This is just how I want the environment to look. So here I'm drawing the basalt rocks on the side, the basalt pillars, and the reflective lake in the middle, with some crystals on the side, and of course the protagonist and her spaceship in the middle. So the next step that I'm taking is making my physical environment in 3D. And I do this for a number of reasons. One is to save myself time on lighting and perspective, but also because it's pretty easy for me to work on my environment in software like this. I'm not super good at 3D, but I'm good enough to know my way around the software and recreate a render of the environment. And one of the major upsides of using 3D for me is that you can place cameras. Right now, I have a camera placed at about the same height as the sketch. So you're seeing the 3D environment pretty much like you would see the sketch. But if I want to have a different approach or like look at the environment in a different from a different angle, I can just do that or with another lens. If I were to sketch one angle just on paper, and I would be interested in looking at the environment from another angle, then I would have to redo the entire piece and also redo the perspective and such. So that is one of the major reasons why I use 3D to as a sort of as a sort of basis to begin my illustrations with. And one of the reasons I actually started working in 3D is um, like using 3D in the first place was because I couldn't choose. I couldn't choose between uh, experimenting and making fun stuff in 3D and working in 2D. There were some things that I really liked about 3D, and there's some things that I really like about 2D. So at some point, I decided to try and combine the two because you have complete creative control about your reference material, basically. Some people use photos or photo bashing, and I've tried that as well. And for me, that was always a bit of a struggle because you're pretty much combining existing materials or existing elements and making something new from that. And with this, I just have complete control about what I'm creating from start to finish. And by no means is using 3D something that I recommend for everyone. I think your workflow should be something that plays to all your strengths. And I know that I can use some of my knowledge of 3D to make 2D a whole lot easier for me. Like I said, using lighting and using perspective saves me so much time when making 3D, and you don't need to be a high level at all. Some people will go way further into making a 3D scene before they start painting over it in 2D. But for me and for everyone, basically, that'll be a different point. Some people will make a cube and then draw an entire city based on that cube made in 3D, and other people will, like I said, make almost a complete scene in 3D and then just touch up in 2D. So where that like divide or where that jump from 3D to 2D comes in is different for everyone. Something you'll see me do here and throughout the whole video basically is just messing around and experimenting and trying out different settings to see what works best. You see me messing about with light here, with camera angles, with focal lengths, with field of view, all that sort of things. And this led me to a couple of situations, a couple of camera angles that I ended up rendering. And all for a different reason. I wanted a different approach. Some to make the scene feel a bit bigger, some to give a better overview about the landscape that this scene takes place in. But ultimately, I went for the bottom right one, like the dead center composition with the ship kind of pointing towards the center of attention, and basically the whole landscape kind of converges at one point to guide the view of the onlooker there, pretty much. So that's why I chose that one for composition purposes. So after choosing the render that I want to further work into an illustration, I moved to Photoshop, and here I'll pretty much just start painting over the scene. Um, I'll try to kind of put more detail into the scene and work on general values as well, make some parts darker, some parts lighter to support the overall composition that I want to go for. And as you can see, one of the things that I've done in the scene itself is also put a reflective material on the bottom. This is also a kind of shortcut, I guess, to not have to be able to figure out the entire reflection when you've already painted the entire scene. So that is something that saves me a little bit of time. For the rest, I'll in the beginning I'll usually work in values only, because with values I can keep a closer eye on if the whole composition or if the composition as a whole will work out, and also because I'm not terribly good with colors. So we'll get back to that when we get there, how I approach putting colors into my illustrations. And for now, I think I will just keep my mouth shut and turn on the music a little higher, and I'll let you watch the rest of this time lapse. And I'll get back to you when I'll be doing color. All right. So the painting, as far as values go, is getting to a level where I feel satisfied enough about it to start putting in some color. And this I'll be doing using gradient maps. I think gradient maps are a great tool to rather easily but also rather quickly put color into your scene. And for me especially, it's a big help because I'm not too proficient with just painting in colors. Uh, that's why I much prefer using values first, making sure those make sense, and then after that, adding the colors. And one of the things that I also think is really great about gradient maps is that at all times, here you can see me using masks for different materials in the scene. At all times, you can kind of you can always tweak the colors of these parts in the scene. So I think that creates a really good non-destructive workflow, if you will, that you can always go back and change another color. And just as I do with 3D and have 3D so I can look at the scene from multiple angles. If I decide somewhere along the process that I want to change something, that I'm going to be able to do that. That's also one of the reasons why I like gradient maps so much. And basically, when I have my gradient maps in, I'll start to paint over those again. I have my basic colors down, and I can just use the color picker tool to grab values and kind of, yeah, just paint with it pretty much. It's mostly the figuring out what color goes where that I find more difficult. So when that's already settled, I have a much easier time by just painting the colors by color picking it and then putting it down somewhere else. Sometimes you see me going back to grayscale again, or like disabling the color gradients to fix some previous or like some compositional matters, like I'm doing here. One thing that I'm also doing, especially during this step, is not zooming in or zooming in as little as possible. I even always have my navigator open in the top right corner of Photoshop, so I can always have a complete view of what my image will look like from a distance. And that insight of what an image will look like from a distance is a very good way to make sure that your composition is still, it reads well, right? So you can check if even at pretty much post-it size, if your composition still makes sense, and if it doesn't, then you can go in and change some things. This is something that I do to pretty much try and not get lost in the details, because that tends to happen pretty quickly in any kind of painting. You just start putting in details and you kind of forget about the bigger picture. So that's why I always have my navigator open, and I always keep looking back to the navigator to check my general overall composition. So at this point, I'm pretty satisfied with the general look of the picture. There is still some balancing to do. Right now, there isn't much focus in the image, and I am adding some details where I feel like they are necessary. One of the things this is with details is one of the only moments that I'll ever actually zoom in during the making process of this image. And like I said, at the same time, I'll still always have my navigator open to check if any details that I'm adding throw off the balance or the composition in any way, shape, or form. Now at this point, I am pretty satisfied with the general look of the painting. It doesn't have much like compositional values in it that I'll fix at the very end when I'm satisfied with everything else. But I was struggling with this cloud, with this smoke a little bit. So I pretty much photo bashed those clouds on top of the geyser, painted it with just the color picking tool, and then in the end, I made the whole layer that I was painting the smoke on black and white, and I used the same gradient map that I used on the rest of the geyser on the smoke, and that's a really easy way to color match different elements from your scene with each other. And you'll see me adding some lightning in a bit as well for some more dramatic effect, that you have a kind of sense that there is really something going on in this painting. And the last step that I will go into in a minute, and that is rather short in the recording, but I usually spend a pretty long time on, is to kind of pull the attention to certain aspects of my painting. So, for example, I want the character, and I want the character pretty much highlighted, and the ship as well. I want the viewer's attention to be drawn to that. And I usually do that by just an adjustment layer, and then making the whole image darker, and then painting in some light. So you can see me do that, I think, right here. Just making it darker and then painting in a little bit of light. And I'll usually do that a couple of times with lightness, but also with saturation and stuff like that. And then in the end, I'll end up with this, the final result. So that was the entire process of how I went about making this particular illustration. I hope it was somewhat interesting to look at. I hope you learned something. And even if not, like, I am in no position to tell anybody what they should be doing. This is just giving you an insight on how I approach these things, so that you may or may not find some helpful tips in this. So, thank you all for watching, and till next time.